I got to tell you a story real quick. I was sitting at my dinner table with my roommate, Linus. This was a number of years ago, and that was really his name, Linus. And my other roommate, by the way, was Charles. I kid you not. Both of them from Appleton. And I'm sitting across the table from Linus, and another friend of mine, Marty, was sitting next to me. He was a guy that was on staff with crew. And I had just asked the question to Linus. And I saw Marty, my buddy, he is like squirming. And he gave me one of those glares like, I am going to kill you when we get a chance to be alone. You know, he gave me one of those glares, and I'm looking down at the table. But I had laid this question out. I'm going to pause there because that question we'll talk about in just a minute. You guys have been walking your way through Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. That's why it's called the book of Acts in the New Testament. And in this book, you see kind of an unveiling of what God is going to do, what Jesus is doing through these early believers and kind of what happens. And along comes this chapter 9, and we're actually introduced to chapter 9 way back at the beginning of chapter 8. Because at the beginning of chapter 8, we find a verse that actually ends a story about Stephen's death, which for those of you that have been here for a while, you probably had somebody come and speak to you about Stephen getting stoned to death. And as he's being stoned, he once again, in a very gracious way, says, Lord, don't hold this against them. And then the end of chapter 7 and heading into chapter 8, it says, and Saul was there giving approval to his death. So we're introduced to this person by the name of Saul, who at that point was standing alongside the part of the murder of this particular guy named Stephen, this martyr named Stephen. And so we're introduced to this guy named Saul. Well, along comes chapter 9, a whole chapter later, and we are reintroduced to Saul once again. If you have a Bible, I'll certainly encourage you to open it up. If you have an electronic device, love to have you do that because I may have somebody read something out loud here in just a minute. But so in chapter 9, we are reintroduced to this guy named Saul. And Saul, it says, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. In other words, Saul is still out to kill these people that are now following Jesus. And Saul wants nothing more than to be a part of putting them to death. We find out later he was horrendous in his actions towards them. And it goes on to say he went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus so that if he found any there who belonged to the way or Christ followers or Christians, whether men or women, so he didn't care whether they were men or women, he might take them to prison as prisoners to Jerusalem. So we're introduced to this guy named Saul who is still out to get these Christians. By the way, Saul had all the aspects of a Jewish resume. He was the epitome of a Jew. I mean, he had it all together. In Philippians chapter 3, later in his life, he talks about all the credentials that he bore. He said, if someone else thinks that they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, he says, I have more than anybody. I was circumcised on the 8th day, which is exactly what a Jewish person was supposed to do, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, I was a Pharisee. I mean, he was the highest level of a Jew that you could possibly attain to. As for zeal, he says, this is in Philippians, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on law, faultless. I followed all the laws, the 682 different laws that are existing. I followed them all. As a matter of fact, later he tells the story again in Acts, and he talks about him being a Jew, that he was born in a certain city, that he studied actually under Gamaliel, who was one of the highest recognized teachers in the Jewish nation. So if you were going to sit under somebody's teaching, to sit under Gamaliel's was like the best place to be. So Saul says, you know, I've done all this. We're going to meet Gamaliel a little bit later as well. But he had the resume of resumes. He had everything together. I don't know what your resume is going to look like. I don't know what your resume looks like today. In terms of our resume with God, some of us try to carry that resume around as well too, right? We try to carry around a a resume that somehow shows that I am better than you, and I'm better than you, and you, and you, because there's certain ways we want to establish ourselves, right? I was brought up in a Protestant church. I got the Sunday school award because I put the most stars, on the little thing. Man, I was baptized, I got confirmed, and I had it all together. I was a B+ student. I was above average in athletics. I was involved in all kinds of stuff, and life was great for me. I had the resume, and then I went to college. Wow, that changed some things, because I went from like that B+ student to I passed classes, most of them. And, as far as athletics, I'd been, kind of an above average athlete. I wasn't great, but I was above average, to the point where in college I had to say to my teammates, if it wasn't for guys like me, you wouldn't look so good. You know where that's at, right? So I told that to my teammates one time. I said, if it wasn't for guys like me, you guys wouldn't look as good. So I found myself in this situation where I thought I had the resume together, in college. And so late in my freshman year, I realized there was something that was amiss. And certainly things were starting to tank for me a little bit. Started to have a lot of questions about faith, started to have a lot of questions about who I was, started to have questions about, the direction of my life. And in the midst of that, I had some college teammates who came alongside me. And to make a long story short, I went to them and I said, you know what? I think there's something in the Bible that I need. I don't know what it is, but like I say, I got the Sunday school award, so there's got to be something there. And so through that, had an opportunity to connect with Crew at that point, and then ultimately, put my faith in Christ during the late part, of my freshman year in college. And so in that, I realized that all the things that I was aspiring to do, to put on a resume, in kind of a spiritual sense, a spiritual resume, those things weren't going to hold any weight for me. And so I came to find out that the resume was not what was needed. Saul had everything in the resume. But if you look and see what goes on here in verse 3, it says, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice say, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? So there's this experience. I mean, the guys that are with him are on the ground. They think the cops are busting them, and bright lights on them. They hear this voice, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Hey, does somebody have a Bible or something open that can look in something real quick? Actually, I want you to look real quick. If you have something, yes, no? Can you look up really quickly Acts chapter 26? I think it's 26. Hang on. I'll do it. How's that? Because I don't know if that's the right place. So I might have you read the wrong thing. And I'll go, yeah, that's not it. Let me just look real quick. In chapter 26, Saul later is telling the same story again, okay? And in chapter 26, it says, he fell to the ground, and I heard a voice say to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? But then it goes on, this is chapter 26 and verse 14, it says, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. That's what it says here in the NIV. So if you look at chapter 26, verse 14, it goes on to say that not only did this voice say, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It also says, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. My question for you is it hard for you to kick against the goads? Yes, exactly. Most of you are like me. You're going, what on earth does that mean? What is goads? Actually, what a goad was in that day was basically a cattle prod. It was like how you moved things, and it would inhibit you from, like it would inhibit sheep from getting. So if you were going to goad somebody, you were inhibiting them from doing something. Does that make it? Badgering would be another way. Pestering would be kind of another. But the voice is saying to Saul here is not only, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? But why are you inhibiting the work that I plan to do? That's really what the voice says to Saul at that point. And so in that, Saul gets this question. The guys around him are like freaking out because they hear the voice, but they don't see anything. Saul, though, has this vision. And you see, Saul then says at that point, he asks the question, "Who are you, Lord?" He wants to know who this voice is, because not only did he hear that voice, he also got a glimpse of this person. Because if you notice, by the way, at the end of chapter 8, when we meet Saul, he has persecuted this guy named Stephen. And now he's going after men and women throughout. He's asking for permission to throw them in jail, put them in prison, kill them. We find out later in other parts that he writes about things that he was doing, torturing them. Actually, he'd start to ask them to renounce their faith. He would torture Christians so that they would renounce their faith. And so, but in the midst of that, Saul has been torturing and persecuting all these Christians, people of the way. The voice says, "Why are you persecuting me?" Which is kind of interesting, because it's not like Stephen saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" It's not like some of these other people. It's Jesus speaking. So Saul has this vision of Jesus. And then he says to him, "Who are you?" Because he wants to know him. And he wants to somehow figure out. And in this very, very, very short little place, we find out that Saul doesn't need a resume. What he needs is a relationship. And so he wants somehow to connect with this thing, who is Jesus, in a different way. And so we find here that Saul asks the question, "Who are you?" It goes on to say, Jesus says, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." In fact, if you went ahead just a couple of chapters again, Saul repeats this story, by the way, several times here in the book of Acts. You probably will get to it at different points. But in Acts chapter 22, in verse 10, actually we read, starting at, verse 8, we find out there's a little bit more of a dialogue that actually took place. And in chapter 22, we find that Saul, in the course of this discussion where Jesus comes and says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? What are you goading me for?" And Saul says, "Who are you?" Jesus actually says at that point, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." His companions don't see the light, but they heard the voice. And then it says in verse 10 of chapter 22, Saul asks a second question. He says, "What should I do?" In other words, in that moment, Saul goes from saying, "Who are you?" and now he responds to this voice, because in some way Saul had been on a mission to torture Christians, but now he's going to go into submission to this voice, this person, Jesus. And so he's going to respond to Jesus. "What should I do?" And Jesus goes on and explains to him at that point what I want him to do. He says, "I want you to go into the city." And by this time, Saul's blind. His buddies have to lift him up, and he can't, say anything. He can't speak. He's absolutely dumbfounded, literally, about what has taken place. They lead him into the city. Somehow he's got to motion them to go there. Says that for 3 days he was blind. He didn't eat or drink anything. And so Saul wants to find out who this Jesus is. He's wants to be in a relationship somehow. He wants to respond somehow to him. And in the midst of this, he gets led into Damascus, this city. While he's there, by the way, this other guy by the name of Ananias gets a message from God that says, "Ananias, I want you to go down to Straight Street." It had nothing to do with other stuff. It was because it was straight. And so he asked him to go down Straight Street, and you're going to find this guy at Judas's house. His name is Saul. And Ananias is like, "Time out, God. This guy is like a persecutor. Like, he's out to get people. He's hunting people down. And he's tracking them down, and he's taking them into prison. He's persecuting them. He's torturing them for their faith. You want me to go talk to this guy?" And God had said, "Go down to talk to this guy named Saul." And Ananias kind of refutes God's call. And once again, God says a second time to him, "No, go." As a matter of fact, if you look in your Bibles, it's "go" with an exclamation point. go to the place I'm telling you. In fact, it goes on, and God gives Ananias this address here. He says, "Go, this man is as a chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings and before the people of Israel." Now get this, it says, "I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." It's interesting, what Ananias is called to do is to go to this guy who's been torturing people like him, and he's supposed to go to this guy and tell him why you're now going to suffer for this person who's just called you, right? This guy that you want to be in a relationship with, this guy you've been called to respond to, you are going to suffer for him. And if you read through much of the New Testament, we find that Saul did suffer tremendously for the cause of Jesus. He has this dramatic change in who he is and in his faith. And so Ananias was invited to be a part of God's witness to Saul, and in turn, Saul was going to be invited to be a part of God's witness to a whole group of people called the Gentiles, which is most of us in here, if not all of us in here. And so Saul, who was a Jew of Jews, ultimately gets called through this to go and take the gospel message to a people that he hated as well, the Gentiles. And yet, Ananias was invited to be a part of that. Saul is invited to be a part of that as well. And ultimately, we find that as Ananias goes, he puts his hands on Saul and he prays for him. Skin like scales falls off of his eyes. Saul can see. Ananias probably did it a little reluctantly, like, what's this guy going to do? Is he going to kill me as a result? But what's interesting is if you fast forward to verse 19 in chapter 9 here, it says, "And after taking some food, he regained his strength, and Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God." The very thing that he was persecuting, it says that at once he began to proclaim. So Saul went from being a persecutor to a proclaimer of Jesus. Back to the dining room table. I sat at the dining room table because one of the things that happened was, in the midst of having in my own life this transformation take place, this buddy of mine, Marty, had been kind of helping me like the disciples had helped Paul teach him about Jesus. Marty had been teaching me about Jesus. And so he said to me, "Why don't you go and share some of that with your roommates?" And so I said, "Sure thing." So I one day went and I said, "Linus, can I talk to you for a minute?" And I need to tell you that Linus was a basketball player. He's like 6'6". He's got these long, gangly legs. He had some of the most annoying habits in the world. He would clink his spoon on his cereal in the morning before anybody was up. Ching, 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 ching. Ching, 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 ching. And anytime he talked to you, he'd always talk to you, and he'd always go like this. It's like, stop it. So he wasn't like the guy I always wanted to be around. He's a good guy. But he's just, and like, okay, I'll talk to Linus about my faith. And I was in kind of a bad mood and had bad things happening. I just was not into this at all. And the reason Marty gave me the dirty look was I had walked Linus through something, and this, by the way, is a long time ago, but we used kind of a tool, a diagram tool, and I was trying to read my way through it upside down. And it's like, just as physical laws govern our universe. I mean, I was totally flubbing the whole thing up, right? And it was just tanking quickly. And Marty's getting more and more agitated. And I got to the point where I said this to him. I said, "Linus, you wouldn't want to put your faith in Jesus, would you?" And Marty's he's like, "I'm going to kill you." What kind of question is that? Like, you don't want to put your faith in Jesus, do you? And Linus looks at me, and I'm like, my head's down. Marty's like, and he's like, yeah, I would. And Marty's head snaps. And I was like, yeah. And so I say, Linus, Marty will tell you how that can happen. And so Linus actually put his faith in Jesus at that table. We walked away from that, though, and Marty basically said, don't ever do that again. You were a moron. But I learned from that, and here's what I learned, that God will have his way despite our feeble attempts. And I think when the Bible tells us, when Jesus said to Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? What good is it to goad me? It's interesting. I mentioned Gamaliel earlier. Saul studied under him earlier, right? So that's kind of his mentor. He's his teacher. If you go back to Acts chapter 5, in Acts chapter 5 we are introduced to him, and it says that he was a leader in the synagogue. Everybody looked up to him. And in the midst of a conversation, they bring Peter in and some of the apostles, and they're gonna have their way with him. They're gonna persecute him. They're gonna execute them. He says, "Listen up, guys." Before, and he names two other previous religious, zealous leaders who had followers. And he says, and I can't remember their names. Look it up in Acts chapter 5. But he says, when they brought in such and such, they killed him. And then what happened to his followers? They just sort of disperse. And then what about such and such? And they killed him, and then his followers dispersed. And he says this. He says, if these people are following this Jesus who we have killed, they're either going to disperse, but if they don't, then we know that it's really the work of God. And so Saul heard that. And so now he's in the midst of persecuting these believers, but now it's not like Jesus hadn't been kind of giving some input to that prior to that moment. The reason I say that is this. There's often times that God is doing things in the people's lives that are around us. I don't know where any of you are that are here tonight. I know some of you, and I know probably kind of where you're at. But there are those of you that are here tonight, maybe for the first time, I don't know. Maybe you've been here all the time, I don't know. But we're at different points, right, in kind of our faith journeys. And so you never know where people are at and what's happening in their life. And so Linus is a roommate of mine. I had another roommate by the name of Bruce. And Bruce was happy-go-lucky, and I went to school at La Crosse, and spent a lot of time on 3rd and 4th Street, Most Wednesday, Thursdays were at Howie's Hofbrau, and life of the party, basketball player, popular, told me all about his sexual exploitations all the time, just full of stuff. Left college, got married, became a very, very successful salesman, very, very successful businessman, made a ton of money. And 2 years ago, he called me out of the blue, and he said to me, "Hey, Eric, I just wanted to let you know something." I'm like, "Hey, great. I haven't talked to you for, several years. It's been probably a decade at that point." And I was like, "Great. Yeah, tell me what's going on." He goes, "I just want to thank you for bringing Jesus into our house." And I was like, "Where did that come from?" I kid you not. I was not the picture-perfect witness in a house, I was a Christian, a young Christian, but by no means was I the picture-perfect, and I'm not today either, but I was not the picture-perfect Christian. But for some reason, Bruce saw Jesus in that, and God was working even in that moment. And he said to me, I just want to thank you for bringing Jesus into our house. I was like, "Bruce, what's going on?" He started telling me about where his life had gone and how, by the world standards, we would say he had it all. I mean, he had all the toys, he had all this and that, but through the course of several bad decisions, his marriage was tanking and family life was kind of falling apart. And he said, the things that are really important in life for me aren't there because of some of the decisions I've made. So we chatted, and I'm happy to say that through the course of our conversations and time and all that sort of stuff has relationship with his wife has been restored, relationship with his kids has been restored, but it's because Jesus came and intervened in his life, and he was able to catch that at the right time. My point of that, though, is in the midst of witness, God invites us to be that witness to people. You have no idea what your influence today is going to have 20 years down the road, potentially in somebody's life. And I bet I can tell you 5 or 10 stories like that in my own life, in my own experience, because I'm old and I have that behind me. You guys haven't had that opportunity, but you'll have that opportunity someday. Saul here had a resume. What he needed was a relationship. Saul had this great resume. What he needed to do was respond to what Jesus was calling him to. Ananias was called to respond and invited into God's work in the life of Saul, so that Saul would be invited into the work of the lives of the Gentile people. God chooses to use us as people to be a part of his witnessing community. I know that's a word that you guys use, but he calls us to be a part of that. But the first thing we have to do is we have to lay aside the resume. By the way, resumes are great. I shouldn't say that resumes aren't good in the educational realm. They're great things to have. But God really doesn't care about your resume. What he cares about is the relationship we have with him. And what he cares about is us responding to him. And what he cares about is his inviting us to be a part of that work and asking us to be involved in that. I know many of you are going off to the fall conference this weekend, and I hope you have a great time. I hope that you can in some way find an invitation from Jesus to be a part of that work. I don't know where you're at, whether you've responded to Jesus, whether you're at the point where you're just kind of trying to check out who this Jesus is, wherever you might be. God calls us and invites us to be a part of that. What's interesting about the rest of this chapter, we find that Saul has this encounter. The rest of this chapter actually kind of talks about Peter. Peter heals a guy. It's all about Jesus. Peter raises Dorcas. That's a great name. Prefer Tabitha, actually. I'm like, forget the Greek. Let's go with Tabitha. Tabitha raises her from the dead. She dies. They anoint her with stuff, and God raises her through Peter. But again, actually, it points to Jesus. Peter points to Jesus as a result of that. That's at the end of chapter 9. But it's kind of a hinge chapter, because what happens is we see the change that happens in Paul, and it's almost the hinge where if you remember, Jesus said, upon this rock I will build this church. He says that he renames Peter at that point. And the reality is it wasn't Peter that he was going to build his church on. He was going to build his church on who he was. And so, but it's a kind of that hinge where transference takes place from Peter to Paul as kind of the central figure in the perpetuation of this movement. But God invites us to be a part of that. And so I encourage you to respond to Jesus, to invite him to be a part of your life as he invites you to be a part of his mission. And certainly, as I mentioned, you have no idea the impact that you might be having even now on the people that you interact with on a day-to-day basis, because again, you just have no clue how God might be using you in the lives of other people to draw them to Jesus. So I encourage you to consider that as you walk the pathway of UW-Platteville. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for inviting us to be a part of your mission. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of your community. And I give you thanks as well for each of these people who you've called here tonight, who you've called to be a part of this campus and certainly this movement that takes place here. God, I look forward to one day being able to hear stories from perhaps even some of these people about how you've used this time in their lives and how it's gone forth as they've ventured out into different places all over the world. And again, am grateful just for this opportunity. I pray a blessing over them. I pray, God, that you would go with them. For those who are going to the fall conference, that you would give them open hearts and acceptive ears to hear from you and through your Spirit. God, would you change their lives? We thank you again just for the time to be together. In Jesus' name, amen.